Okay, so we're going to talk. This first section is just going to be about the cells of the nervous system. So we're getting into the nervous system. We're going to spend a lot more time talking about the electrical properties, but this is just cells, and it's more just information for you. So hopefully we can move through it pretty fast. Also structure. So when we talk about the nervous system, it's really broken down into two parts. It's the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, and these are really easy to keep straight. The central nervous system is just the brain and spinal cord. That's it. If there's anything, any nervous tissue outside the brain and spinal cord, we call that the peripheral nervous system. Peripheral nervous system. Okay, so CNS means central nervous system, PNS means peripheral nervous system. So if we further subdivide, there are no more subdivisions to the central nervous system, that's just it. But if we further subdivide the peripheral nervous system, we have what we can call afferent and efferent. And afferent just means that it's going toward the central nervous system. So this tends to be things like sensory. Okay. So monitoring what's going on outside the central nervous system, and then sending that information to the central nervous system. If it's going from the periphery to the CNS, it's afferent. If it's going away, we call that efferent. Okay, so now that can be primarily it's muscle control. Okay, so but when we think about muscle, so efferent here has its own subdivisions. And because when we think about muscle control, there are muscles that we have full control over, so that's conscious. And then there are things that are not under conscious control. So we further subdivide, hope you're keeping this straight, the efferent into somatic or autonomic. Somatic stands for body, but that's something that we have under conscious control. So that's conscious muscle control. Autonomic means it's not under conscious control, and that doesn't necessarily mean muscle. So we have a fight or flight response where um, and really you can break a lot of it down to muscle. Sympathetic response, that's part of the autonomic nervous system, so we can call this the ANS. And that's further divided into sympathetic or parasympathetic. Sympathetic is your fight or flight. So the way this is broken down again into muscle is that when you activate, remember this is autonomic, when your fight or flight response is activated, when something jumps out and it scares you, you have vasodilation, vasoconstriction of blood vessels. You have an increased heart rate. You have your airways will open up, things like that. And those are all smooth muscle control. And you don't have conscious control of smooth muscle. And we'll talk about that more when we discuss the muscle system. But that's why it falls under this autonomic. Okay, and it's a signal going out, which is why that further falls under efferent. And then there's the parasympathetic, which we call the rest and digest. Okay, so if you can kind of keep that straight, CNS, just remember that's brain and spinal cord, and then the PNS divides into these two categories, afferent, efferent, and then efferent divides into somatic, which is conscious, and autonomic, which is not, and then autonomic further divides into sympathetic, which is your fight or flight response, and parasympathetic, which is your rest and digest. Okay, so that's going to come into play a lot more this semester, like when we talk about respiration and the heart and things like that. We'll come back and we'll talk about sympathetic and parasympathetic. Okay, so parts of a neuron. A neuron is just a cell. Okay, so it's a cell. I was going to say it's a cell like any other cell, but it's a cell that's different. It's specialized. It's a neuron. But it still has a cell membrane, and it still has a nucleus. It still has a Golgi apparatus and an endoplasmic reticulum and peroxisomes and lysosomes and all those good things. But it's really the structure that is different with the neuron. It has these projections. This is the cell body here. Okay, so this part right here is the cell body, which is labeled there. And so that contains the nucleus. But then it has these projections, which they're not actually projecting, they're input portions. So another neuron might be communicating with these little processes here that are called dendrites. Okay, so dendrites are the input portion. Okay, because remember, it's the job of a neuron to communicate. So it gets a signal in, usually from another neuron to the cell body or to the dendrites, and then the signal will move in that direction. Okay, so dendrites, input portion, cell body, and then this segment here is called the axon. Okay, so this is the axon. This whole thing that runs here, it's covered right now with, this one happens to be covered with myelin, okay, that we'll talk about myelin today. But this is the axon. And that's where the signal propagates. That's always the word that's used for this. Propagates or moves along. So we'll just say that propagates signal. Okay, and that's what the axon does. So the signal travels down here, and then it moves down here to the axon terminal, or just the terminal, or the axon bulb, or the axon. It has a lot of different things. Presynaptic axon terminal. It's presynaptic because this is a synapse, this part right here, where they come together, and then this is the next neuron, so we say that's postsynaptic. But it's the axon terminal. Okay, so those are the main parts of the neuron, and they've broken it up into the input signal, and then integration happens in the cell body, and then the output, which is what happens at the axon terminal. But those are really the main parts. And so if we remember input, the signal propagates, and then you have the synapse, okay, at the axon terminal. Now there are a bunch of different kinds of neurons. What we just saw was what's called a multipolar neuron, but we'll talk about that in a second. So there's a functional classification, then a structural classification. The functional, we just used the term in the last slide, 2 slides ago, afferent. Okay, so afferent or sensory. So that's kind of a functional thing. That means that a sensory signal is coming from the periphery to the CNS. Okay, so that's afferent, and then motor, which is efferent. So that's going that direction, that's going this direction. Okay, so afferent this way, efferent, exit this way. Okay, and then we have interneurons. Interneurons are just that. They're neurons between other neurons. They're usually very small. They're just short communicating neurons. Okay, so we'll use that term interneuron, and we'll say that there's a neuron that goes, and then there's an interneuron, and then there's another neuron. So that short one would be an interneuron. Okay, now the structural classification, the way they look, this is actually fairly simple. If you look at the cell body, and then so the cell body is here, and then you count how many processes are going out. This one has multiple processes going out. Okay, you see all these dendrites, multiple processes going out, plus there's the axon here. So this is called a multipolar. Okay, so this is multipolar, this one. If you look at this one, this is the cell body. It only has 2. 1, 2. So we call it bipolar. Okay, because it has 2 processes coming out. And then if you're paying attention, and I say this is the cell body here, you say how many processes are going out? 1. Somebody says that. Then that's a unipolar. Okay, so this is a unipolar neuron. So if we look at these again, I mean it's fairly easy to see. Multipolar because multiple processes. 1, 2 processes, and 1 process. Okay. All right. So cells of the nervous system. The thing to remember is that when you have your axons up here, and then you have your cell body, and then you have your dendrites. I'm sorry, these are dendrites. Okay, and then your cell body here, cell body, and then your axon. And then your axon terminal down here. That's really huge. Remember the cell body is here, and it has a nucleus. And when we remember anything, it's that the nucleus is where proteins are made. Okay, so that's where a lot of stuff is going on. Your organelles are being made here, proteins are being made, vesicles, all this stuff is being made in the cell body. But the active zone is down here. Okay, so we have to get all of that stuff somehow all the way down here. Now, when you're talking about a person, they may have to get a signal all the way down your leg. So you may have to have a single cell, a single neuron, maybe going all the way from the bottom of your spine to the tip of your toes, one cell. And so that means all of that information, all of that stuff, proteins, organelles, all of that stuff has to be moved down to the end. And then wastes have to be moved back. And we call that axonal transport. And there are two different types. There's slow axonal and fast axonal transport. Okay, so that's just moving things up and down the axon. Aptly named axonal transport. Slow axonal moves really slow. It varies 0.2 to 2.5 millimeters per day. A millimeter is not very much. And so for it to only move 0.2 to 2.5 millimeters a day, that's pretty slow. And so when we talk about fast axonal transport, that's 400 millimeters a day. Okay, 400 millimeters a day is less than half a meter, okay, because a meter is 1,000 millimeters. Okay, so that's actually, even though it's called fast axonal, if you think about how far it is from the end of your spine to the bottom of your leg, it's well more than that. So that means it's going to take more than a day for materials to move from here from the cell body to the axon terminal. Okay, and it can go in two different directions. If it's moving toward the axon terminal, we call that anterograde, and backwards we call it retrograde. Okay, so from the cell body to the axon terminal, antero, and then from the axon terminal back, which is going to be wastes. Okay, usually that's retrograde. Okay, so if we look at this is what we're talking about. So we're seeing that there are things being packaged into vesicles, and then these vesicles they latch onto these microtubules, and they use these proteins called dynein and kinesin, and they just walk. They walk along here, taking their time until they get to the end, and then they drop it off, and then they might pick up some waste, and they might move back. Okay, so this retrograde, anterograde this direction, retrograde back. Okay, but that's axonal transport. So it answers some questions when you're thinking, gosh, how did everything get all the way down here if the cell body is making it? Well, that's how it does it. Okay, so now the next cells we talk about, we've been talking about neurons, okay, that nicely have the cell body and then the axon and then the axon terminal. But when they looked at cells under a microscope, when they looked at nervous tissue under a microscope, they saw the neurons, okay, just fine. But then they also saw these other cells that were just sort of out there, and they were clinging to things, and all they seemed to be was this glue that was holding the neurons in place. And so they called them glial cells. Glia means glue. Okay, but then they found out that they actually serve a purpose. So some of them we're going to be talking about are something called astrocytes. Now, if you're familiar with cancer, you may have heard of an astrocytoma or even a glioma. A glioma just means it's an out of control growth of glial cells, but an astrocytoma would be an out of control growth of astrocytes. But astrocytes serve a very, very important function. Okay, one of the functions that they have is they are responsible for the blood-brain barrier. Now the brain doesn't want all of the molecules that exist in the blood, and so it's very selective about what it brings through. And it's the astrocytes, these cells, that do that. And I'll have a picture that kind of makes a little more sense about that in a second. But they control the extracellular environment, so they'll take up extra stuff like potassium sometimes builds up out here, and they'll absorb that and they'll take it in, and they might release it on another side over here. Okay, so they're kind of a nice little housekeeping cell. Microglia, your brain has its own immune system. Okay, so I know we haven't talked about the immune system, but there are things like B cells and T cells and all of these immune cells that are made in the periphery and outside the nervous system But in the nervous system, in the central nervous system, those things aren't allowed. They're excluded along as part of the blood-brain barrier. So it has its own cells. The brain has its own immune cells, and those are called microglia. And then there are ependymal cells, which produce something called cerebral spinal fluid. Okay, so they just sit there, and that's one of their jobs, is that they just start producing this salty kind of solution called cerebral spinal fluid. So that's what ependymal cells do. And then oligodendrocytes. And we're going to talk a lot about oligodendrocytes versus Schwann cells. And oligodendrocytes and Schwann cells both make myelin. Oligodendrocytes make myelin in the central nervous system, while Schwann cells make it in the peripheral nervous system. Okay. All right. So to look at this, to expand on this a little, okay. I just mentioned that Schwann cells in the peripheral nervous system, they make this substance called myelin. And also in the peripheral nervous system, there are these things called satellite cells, which are kind of like the astrocytes of the peripheral nervous system, and they just kind of surround the cell bodies and make sure that the environment is okay there. The ones we're really going to talk about, though, in a little while, are going to be the myelin producing cells. So if we look at all of these together, the central nervous system molecules, or I'm sorry, the central nervous system cells, glial cells. Here are the ependymal cells. This is a picture of an astrocyte, because they're called astrocytes because they look like stars. Microglia, which are immune cells, and then oligodendrocytes, and this guy is putting down this substance called myelin. Okay. And then all together, if you look at them all together, you can see here's the astrocyte. That's, it's the blood-brain barrier. So it's allowing certain things from this capillary that's running through here, or blood vessel that's running through here, and it's allowing certain things to go in and certain things to go out. It's allowing the passage of something into or out of the cell, or out of the nervous system. These are just regular neurons, and then we can see the microglia, which are immune cells here. Ependymal cells, these are the guys that are oozing out, constantly just oozing out. So over here, oozing out cerebral spinal fluid. Okay, that's what their job is. Okay, and then we see the oligodendrocyte. The oligodendrocyte is making this myelin. So it's myelinating these axons. So now you might see an axon that is unmyelinated. You can kind of see a portion of one over here. But then these cells, these oligodendrocytes, they have all these branches and feet popping out that are putting this myelin, this fatty substance, around the axons to insulate them and actually make them faster. Okay. So if we say a little bit more about astrocytes, they have processes that form feet that cover the surface of the neurons and the blood vessels. So we saw that, and they regulate what substance reach the blood. So they're responsible again for the blood-brain barrier. Protect neurons from toxic substances, allows exchange of nutrients, prevents fluctuations in composition of blood. So if something happens in the blood where something gets built up, like potassium or sodium, that would be very bad for the brain. So the astrocytes are kind of responsible for saying, okay, we don't want your extra potassium, or we don't want your low potassium. We want to maintain it ourselves. So that way, you can still think, and if you're low on potassium, your brain still functions well enough that you can go find it. Okay, so myelin. We're going to talk a lot about myelin in the next section too. Myelin speeds up action potentials, and that's all we're really going to say about it right now. We're going to get into how it does that later. But there are specialized cells, and like I said, in the periphery, they're called oligodendrocytes, or in the central nervous system, they're called oligodendrocytes. In the periphery, they're called Schwann cells, and they look a little bit different. So here you can see the Schwann cells are a single cell that just wraps around and around and around, and it just kind of goes in a circle, and it wraps around, and it forms this little sheath. Okay, and the oligodendrocyte, they send out these processes, and one single cell can myelinate a whole lot of neurons or axons, and they do this just by sort of growing in a spiral way. So it starts to grow here, and then it just keeps going around and around and around the axon until it's very, very thick. Okay, and the end product is a bunch of different myelin sheaths with these little nodes in between, and that little node is called a node of Ranvier. Okay, so it's not pronounced Ranvier, it's node of Ranvier. Okay, so we'll talk about what happens at the node of Ranvier versus what happens where it's insulated, because that's very important for speed of transmission. Okay, all right, so that's a myelinated cell. It should cover all of the different glial cells, plus explain what the difference between a neuron and glia cell are. So that's really all I wanted to cover in this little section.